James Kirk Wall. Love a guy who is proud that he was named after a starship captain.
I was recently challenged to a debate by a Christian named David Vogel, with the subject being, can the Bible be trusted as a source of moral guidance? And the topic of historical Jesus came up.
A lot of ways this kind of gets into, factual questions of history that I'm thinking probably, neither of us really were anticipating focusing on this evening. If you want to get into it, we could more. But I would just say that generally speaking, my view is that if you look at, particularly at the New Testament, that there's sufficient reason to believe the accounts of Jesus' life, of his teaching, of his, particularly crucially, of his death and resurrection, that those were historical events, that therefore that would give a verification to his words, and then because he trusted and spoke of the Old Testament also as being inspired, that's in a very brief nutshell would be the reasoning for why I would then be willing to say, okay, this Bible needs to be treated more seriously because it is God's word come down to us, as opposed to just a man claiming to speak for God, and because then the authority comes from up there, as opposed to just a person's words. That would justify a different perspective. And again, certainly, I think obviously we would disagree on the historical questions in a big way. I don't know if you want to pursue that further, or if that's enough to just at least give, that's my perspective on that first question.
Yeah. Well, on the history, for a long time, I really didn't know much about the historical evidence. I had seen on the teaching company, Bert Ehrman's about Jesus Christ, and that's where he brought up a lot of things I weren't aware of. As far as the history, mentioning that they were basically collecting these works and putting a name underneath them because none of them specifically said who the author was, and I think raising a lot of questions. And I know there's also mythicists out there that are claiming from the movie Zeitgeist that it was actually, some stories are referring to consolation, as far as rising and falling, and having these other more mythical type of origins, and questioning the actual historical evidence for Jesus.
Sure. Now, that is actually one thing is a common misconception as far as the documents having names attached to them, is actually bizarre. If you look at the documentary evidence, those manuscripts of particularly the four Gospels would be the allegedly historical accounts, and they were actually circulated with names attached to them. Not all of, well, it's hard to say. Not all of them have come down to us with names attached to them, but typically ancient documents like that would very often have essentially like a cover sheet, so-and-so by this person. And those that we do have, and we do have many that did have the names of apostles attached to them, the gospel according to this person's name. It's pretty, I believe without exception actually, that the gospel we call, say, the Gospel of John, when we find it with a name attached to it, which we do often find in those, the ancient copies that we have, it was, John's name that was there, and you don't have copies of it with, Fred's name attached. That if there is a name, it's going to be John's name, which does give, I think, more confidence as far as the, the primary authorship of it.
Right. Now, John was was the later
yes.
gospel.
Yes.
I believe it's Matthew is believed to be the first, from what I understand.
Yeah, Matthew or Mark.
But I also understand there's no original documents. Basically, it is copies of what is believed to be the original documents, and a selection of which ones will be included. And you mentioned, so with John, perhaps there's some that don't have a name, but you believe they can still be tied. And I'm not sure how specifically they, you could validate that certain pieces of information and incomplete works could be tied to one specifically or the other, at least with certainty.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you have to look at it like any other ancient document in the sense of, you look at the earliest existent copies. There's no ancient document that actually has the originals. When you're writing on papyrus 2,000 years ago, not so long survival unless it happens to get lucky and be stored in a clay jar or something like that. But you do have copies as early as about 100 years after the originals were written, which is much, much earlier than Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, Suetonius, the historian Tacitus. Those documents that we rely on, for all of our ancient history, Josephus, those copies are hundreds of years after the originals are the first surviving copies that we have, whereas the Bible copies, just because they were so widely copied in the Mediterranean ancient world, you've got surviving copies in tremendous quantity. There's something like 10,000 just in Greek, and well over 10,000 in Latin and other languages as well. Not all of them, of course, being very early. Some of them are quite a bit later.
Sure.
But you've got surviving copies of quite an early lineage. And then you can trace out, where they were copied, and some copies went to Egypt, some copies went to the Western Church in Rome and Italy, some went to Asia Minor, and so you can see where potentially copying errors got introduced, things like that. And
right.
you've got sorry, go ahead.
And then some of the copies tell slightly different stories, as well, because without mass communication, if you have a group of people making copies over time and originally turning stories told orally into a written copy, and then making copies, wasn't it the ancient sea scrolls that they discovered, which were copies that told slightly different accounts?
I don't know if you're referring typically as far as the particular documents that are in the New Testament. They as far as variants, you can say, and again, it's hard without particular examples, to really to say, okay, well, this is a variant that appears here, and let's look at the textual evidence for it, because it's a lot of just cross-referencing, and there's this variant here that doesn't appear in all these other copies, and it's plainly, if you look at the scribal technique that was used, then probably, there's a good way to explain that this variant was caused by this kind of scribal error that's common, that sort of thing. So it's hard without that kind of particular example to cite, to really be able to speak too specifically to the accuracy of the copies. But I generally speaking, if you do get that kind of cross-referencing, you can say with a great degree of certainty what, say Matthew, what did Matthew originally say? You've got very, very good textual evidence for what the original document said. Now, what I think you were referencing was like alternative gospels, that kind of idea, like Gnostic gospels or other religious documents that didn't end up in the New Testament.
They found a Gospel of Judas.
Yeah.
I think they've found some other Gospels as well.
Yeah,
and
Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter.
Right, and then is during the time that Jesus is said to live, Barterman mentioned that the philosophers during the time, that the government officials during the time, you don't see records there. It's in. That's when mythicists start to argue, well, these stories you're seeing, which you're attributing to Jesus, well, these are actually earlier characters that had the rebirth and similar types of stories. I think I heard mentioned Apollonia had similar stories, and Horace has older stories, and so possibly what's being attributed to Jesus is actually something else entirely.
Sure. And I think there again, there's different ones, so-called virgin birth narratives or things like that, and without really particularly having a single example to dig into, it's hard to. It's hard. You kind of got to speak in generalities. But if you do look at the particular examples that are offered, you've got everything from stories of Greek gods that supposedly impregnated women, and they're would say that's a similar kind of virgin birth narrative, that kind of thing. There's really pretty significant differences. The similarities are greatly overstated. I would argue again, and we could look at particulars. If you have particular examples to consider. But I think really the more important question to me is, you could say that we've got an account of, the fall of Rome. But you could say, well, look, I mean, there have been so many other stories of cities falling. Can't we just imagine that the fall of Rome is just, a copy of those other stories of cities falling? And you have to look then, okay, so what's our documentary and what's our historical evidence for the fall of Rome, for this particular event? And what I would argue then is, based on the quality of the historical evidence and the documentary evidence that we have from copies and as we were just talking about, that you've got a much better historical foundation for trusting the actual events of Jesus' life than some other mythological, whether there were parallels or not.
In certain cases, like the Civil War or whatever event you want to bring up where nobody's currently alive, the best source of history, they're looking for primary sources, they're looking for writings, sources of people that were actually there at the time, and obviously they're looking for other stories written by people during that time that basically complement each other.
Totally.
I remember some people arguing, well, Socrates was just completely invented and didn't exist, but actually it's more than Plato that wrote about Socrates. You can find another writing as well. And plus, I don't understand why it's so hard to believe that an annoying stonecutter that was a real pain in the ass never existed. It seems pretty plausible.
Definitely. In fact, more plausible than God become man and lived and died. Absolutely, you'd need a stronger burden of proof on that one. And yeah, I think I feel like we have really only barely scratched the surface on the historical kind of question. And obviously, there's arguments that you could make and I could make, and proceed on that. I don't know if you want to go further, or if you want to just kind of agree to disagree on the question of historical evidence, since that wasn't really, I know I didn't prepare too much specifically on that point, and you perhaps could prepare more as well. Do you want to proceed further on that, or do you want to shift to your second critique as far as morality?
We could shift to the second critique. I'm not Richard Carey or a real expert on that subject.
In the study of history as an academic discipline, a primary source, also called original source of evidence, is an artifact, a document, diary, manuscript, autobiography, a recording, or other source of information that was created at the time under study. Is any of the historical evidence for Jesus considered to be a primary source? The answer is no. Now, neither David or I are experts in the field, but there's certainly experts available, one of them being Bart Ehrman.
As I studied more and more using my intelligence as an evangelical, but also praying about it, I became convinced that the New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. The first point to make is the rather obvious one that the Gospels don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They are all anonymous. The titles in your Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth, were added by later editors. They were not put there by the original authors. Second point, none of the Gospels claims to be written by the person whose name it bears. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are later traditions that were added to the Gospels. These traditions do not start appearing for about 100 years. Some people think that there is an early church father named Papias who attests to the witness of Mark and Matthew, but in fact there are very solid reasons for thinking that Papias, who lived around the year 120 to 140, is not referring to our Mark or our Matthew. The first time anybody refers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is Irenaeus in the year 180, 100 years after these books were written. My understanding of the Gospels, as they've come down to us, is that they were anonymous, and we don't know their names, and they're not built on eyewitness testimony. But the important point that I want to make is that even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, or even if they did contain eyewitness accounts, that would not guarantee that they were accurate. Think about our legal system today. Are eyewitnesses always accurate in what they report? If so, why do we have trials that call in testimony more than one eyewitness? If eyewitnesses were always 100% accurate in what they report, we wouldn't need law courts. If we wanted to know what happened, we would simply ask somebody. Eyewitnesses do not always get all the information right. But even if they did, it wouldn't matter because the Gospels of the New Testament don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, and in fact they were not written by eyewitnesses. The Gospel writers were living 40 to 50 to 60 years after Jesus died. They wrote the Gospels in Greek. Jesus' language was Aramaic. These Gospel writers were living in a different country. Decades later, where did they get their information from? They were not the followers of Jesus. They don't claim to be followers of Jesus, the disciples. They're written by later people, decades later, in a different language. Where did they get their information from? They heard stories about Jesus that had been in circulation year after year after year, decade after decade, down to the time that the gospel writers living in a different country, speaking a different language, heard the stories. What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes changed the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable. But the unfortunate thing about Jesus is that we have such scanty documentation about his life. Most people don't realize this. But Jesus is never mentioned in any Greek or Roman non-Christian source until 80 years after his death. There is no record of Jesus having lived in these sources. In the entire first Christian century, Jesus is not mentioned by a single Greek or Roman historian, religion scholar, politician, philosopher, or poet. His name never occurs in a single inscription, and it is never found in a single piece of private correspondence. 0, zip, references.
Would you believe someone who claimed to have seen Bigfoot? Would you believe someone who claimed to have been abducted by aliens? If not, why would you believe that ancient men claiming to speak for God actually were more than the millions of other men making the same claim?
Cisco, do we have to leave all our good friends now? Only until next time, Pancho. Adios, amigos.